What I've done here is mapped the area of Israel at the time of Jesus, mapping out the different regions. To give you a quick overview, this is kind of my background. I'm a geospatial scientist, and I wanted to look at the time frame between the call that the disciples had to follow Jesus in Mark chapter 1, which occurred up here in off the Sea of Tiberias, Sea of Galilee, just south of Capernaum. In Mark chapter 1, 16 through 20, we remember the story where they made the statement, "Come follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." At once they left their nets. And that was to Peter and Andrew and James and John. And we know the story very well. But really, was that a one-off? Was that just a moment in time? And looking at the Gospel of Mark, it seems like it's early on. Mark is a very curt, brief gospel, the shortest gospel, 16 chapters. It's written to an audience, a Roman audience that really had a Western mindset in a lot of ways, a short attention span. They had a mind of wanting to be entertained, and you'll see Mark as he jumps through instances to instance to instance, kind of an appeasement towards that mentality and reaching that type of audience. But getting back to the story, we got this Mark 1 moment. And do we know the backstory? What had they seen in Jesus? How much time had they spent? And it's good to get a spatial perspective. Most of these towns you're very familiar with: Bethsaida, Capernaum, obviously Nazareth, Nain, Sychar, that's where the woman at the well was in Samaria, Jericho, Jerusalem, Masada, Joppa, we remember that in the book of Acts. So these are very familiar, and these are sites that were frequented during this journey prior to this Mark 1 moment. You know, one of the points that I like to make with friends of mine as I'm looking at what a disciple is, and I had made in the past, is the aspect that they left at once. This finality, this decision, this abruptness. And I believe there is that moment. There's a moment in time that we understand this was the time that I really engaged. But they had time to look at Jesus, to look at his life, to look at what made him tick. They were making a decision to follow a rabbi, and they had a backstory that I personally had not looked at chronologically, and it's helped me to understand what they had seen and what they based their decision on. And the second thing I want to look at is not just the characteristics for following this rabbi, but to look at Peter and to see if this call in Mark 1 was just a one-off, or was there a time that he needed a second call? And maybe there was, and maybe there wasn't, but I want to hit that at the end. So, quick overview: this is Judah, this is Samaria, this is the Decapolis. Along this backside of the Dead Sea is Perea, the region of Perea. This is Galilee. This is the Sea of Galilee. This is the Dead Sea. And the distances between the bottom here, or the southernmost portion of the Dead Sea, to the top of the Sea of Galilee is about 120 miles, so quite a distance. And we'll see the movement as Jesus mobilizes his mission as he begins things. So Jesus was baptized right about this area right here, the Jordan, by John. He goes into the desert and into the wilderness, somewhere out in here, obviously. Proceeds down to Bethany, where he continues to baptize. And at that time, John is also there, and he points out Jesus to a couple of his followers. And he says, follow them, follow that rabbi. And they proceed to follow Jesus. We have a story in John 1 of the realness of Jesus just wanting to spend the day with these guys, and the banter that goes back and forth, giving Peter a nickname and such, and great story. So Andrew's found. Andrew finds his brother Peter. Eventually Philip is found, and Philip goes out to his other Bethsaida neighbor, whether it's a brother or not, but it's his neighbor, Nathanael. And it's there that Nathanael comments negatively towards Jesus and coming from that hometown of Nazareth. And Jesus does not get bent out of shape, but is actually complimentary towards someone who's actually open and honest with their opinions and thoughts. And Nathaniel's taken aback, and so they that group then moves forward, and they travel the 120 miles up to Jordan, probably going through and around Bethsaida, around to Capernaum, and eventually to Cana of Galilee, to go to a wedding, an invite to a wedding that occurred at that time. And so if we zoom in here, they wind up in Cana, and they attend a wedding. In Cana, Jesus performs his first miracle. He submits to his mom's request and performs his first miracle, and it was really at that time that people started opening their eyes to this young rabbi. Now, why were they invited to the wedding at Cana? Well, it's only 3.5 miles from Nazareth to Cana, so I'm sure there was a connection with the family that was hosting the wedding. Later, I put Nain in here. It's not part of this story, but just to give perspective, why would Jesus leave Capernaum, go all the way to Nain to heal that woman later in the Gospels, raise that woman's son, that widow's son, from the dead? Again, neighboring town, barely 5.5 miles away. So these were distances that give us perspective as far as what was going on at this time. So anyways, he travels to Cana, performs the miracle in the wedding, and then he takes a few days. He goes back up to Capernaum, and this would be his home base. He spends a few days. He brings his mom and his brothers with him. So I hadn't really read that before, but he spends time with them. They're along with his trip. And so this whole process began roughly, I would say in March, with the process of Jesus being baptized and meeting these guys. And then by the time we get to the moment of the Passover, another month has transpired, and it's time for him in April to take his guys and go on down to Jerusalem. So he travels 100 plus miles, gets down to Jerusalem, and we pick that up in John chapters 2 and 3, where two interactions happen. He clears the temple. We see the disciples see his passion, his intensity over his Father's house. And then finally, he meets Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a teacher, and we see Jesus having kind of a pointed discussion with Nicodemus and calling him out in a lot of ways. He says, "You're Israel's teacher. You don't know these things." And you can see the confidence in who he is. And the disciples were able to see that confidence in what he was teaching. And so he spends time there, and later he leaves there and he spends time in Judea baptizing. And then later he decides to move up through Samaria. And it's at Sychar where we learn that from John chapter 4 that he meets up with a Samaritan woman. And Sychar is right near Jacob's well. They spend a few days there where he's able to speak and teach, and big impact. And so the disciples are able to see this connection with the Samaritan woman, who, number one, was a Samaritan. Jesus decided not to go around Samaria, which many Jews did at that time, to get to Galilee, because they had such a hatred towards Samaritans. She was a Samaritan, and also she was probably had a background that put her on the fringe as far as possible sin in her life. Actually, there was sin in her life, and yet that made that connection, and a whole town is affected by that. The disciples see that. So he continues on, and he heads to Cana again. And so his second visit to Cana, and he heals a royal official's son. We see that also in John 4. At this time, he buzzes down to Nazareth, his hometown. It's time in the synagogue. It's his time to read. He pulls out the scroll and finds the passage in Isaiah and basically says, "I'm the man. The scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And obviously it causes a stir with his hometown. And he basically calls them out, saying, "Hey, you guys, there's no respect for a prophet in his own town." And he talks about miracles that happened in the outside the Jewish construct. He talks about a Syrophoenician person who was healed, and Naaman, I believe, too. Maybe I can't remember if it was Naaman or not, but all these individuals came from the neighboring Gentile area. That was very offensive to the folks in Nazareth, and they chased him out of town, almost killed him. And so from that point, he continues forward, and at that moment, he hits this area right here, and we have that Mark 1 moment. So what's happened is we've had 8 months transpire. This has taken us all the way till November of year 1. So about 8 months have transpired between that John 1 moment, meeting them way down past the Dead Sea, to getting to this point in time. And we see him calling these guys and saying, I will make you fishers of men. 8 months, 285 miles have been passed. And in those 285 miles, there was times that we don't have recorded. We have times where they saw him interact and move. And we have little bits and pieces that are recorded. But there was enough there for them to be totally moved to make that decision to leave the boats and to move forward. But then as a side note, they leave and they go to Capernaum, and he spends time, he casts an evil spirit out. He heals Simon's mother-in-law from a fever, and she waits on him and serves him afterwards. And this is all in Mark 1. Later it says that early the next morning, while it was still dark, he got up and went in a solitary place and found a place of prayer. And the guys saw his relationship with the Father. They saw him preaching everywhere in Galilee at that time. That's what he did. But I want to add one final thought here, too, is that right after this, we have the time where possibly we have a second call of Peter, especially. And if you put these moments in time of Mark 1 and Luke 5 side by side, you'll see a few differences. But the biggest one is that in Mark 1, we see Jesus calling them to fish for men in a future tense. And here, Peter gets in a boat, and an astonishing number of fish are caught. He gets down on his knees and says, away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. And then Jesus says, don't fear. From now on, you'll catch men. So it becomes a present tense type of thing. And so could be, but regardless, it doesn't change the story as far as the backdrop. But, in summary, you have to ask what these guys had seen prior to them making that decision to move. They had spent casual time. They'd seen Jesus as a normal person. He had normal banter back and forth, giving nicknames and such. Jesus valued honesty. That's what they saw with Nathanael. He was not taken aback by the affront from Nathanael and his directness. I remember first moving to Boston and being very fearful of interactions with individuals who were very, very upfront with who they thought you were, and you better get used to that. There's total honesty in a lot of ways. If somebody liked you, you knew it. If somebody didn't like you, you knew that too. You better be able to take it. So we saw that he went to Cana and he valued family. He was there, changing the water to wine. But then again, we saw that he didn't put them first. We saw in Nazareth, his family was probably present during that moment. He spoke in the synagogue, and yet he still made the statement. And were they part of the crowd that was wanting to take his life? Who knows? But later he had concern. He had concern for others' family too. We saw him with Simon's mother-in-law. So his being a rabbi was just not theoretical, not just a teacher. It was engagement. We saw the passion for clearing the temple. We saw him willing to challenge religious authority and thought with Nicodemus. We saw him engage those on the fringe with that Samaritan woman who was a woman, a Samaritan, and a quote-unquote sinner. And then we saw him being seen with his relationship with the Father as he spent time early in the morning praying, and the time spent there. So in a nutshell, there was a lot that these guys had seen. They had spent time. And I know that as I talk with friends of mine, I want to tell the backstory. It doesn't mean that it's going to take 8 months for them to make a decision to follow, but I'm not going to be as quick to say in that first or second time together, are you ready to make are you ready to leave the boat at this moment? They might be, but it's imperative to share the backdrop and what's really happened here, what they saw, what characteristics moved them towards this moment of leaving the boat. And then secondly, too, the other tie-in to this whole thing is that if it was the case that there were two callings for Peter, sometimes we think that, yes, I've made an incredible decision to follow, and yet it's followed up with the eureka moment, with the big change. And so there might be a couple times where you've made big decisions, but there was one that was really significant. And so I think it's important to see. I know in my life, I made a big decision to start praying and engaging in mission at Virginia Tech when I was really on the fringe with my walk with God and with the kingdom. I was really on the outskirts, and yet I saw a group of people that were really engaged in their walk, and decided to start getting up at 5 a.m. and spending time with them in prayer and sharing with my friends. And yet I don't see that as really the time that everything changed. The time that it changed was later. I went to a conference, and there was a birth and death population clock that was started at the beginning of the 3-day conference. And I just watched that clock tick off. Births and deaths and population rose, and was very challenged that what am I doing with my life with God? How much of an impact can I make to offset or to try to help some of these individuals as they are part of a number just moving forward? And really that was the time that my stepping out of the boat moment. And so hopefully these thoughts resonate somewhat, but this does give me a good backdrop and a good backstory for everything that happened prior to that Mark 1 moment.